The silence was the thing that undid him. Every alpha king in the history of Artoria had rejected a mate at least once. It was not uncommon. Politics demanded it. Bloodlines demanded it. Sometimes the fates were simply inconvenient, choosing women from the wrong families, the wrong ranks, the wrong circumstances. And when a rejection was delivered, the rejected always wept. They always begged. They fell to their knees, or they screamed, or they pressed their hands to their chests as if they could physically hold the bond together before it snapped. King Kalen had witnessed 3 rejections at his own court in the past decade. He had expected the same from the woman standing before him now. He had not expected this. Lyra of House Voss stood perfectly still in the center of the great hall, her hands loose at her sides, her chin level. She was not beautiful in the way court women were beautiful, not polished or jeweled or arranged. She was a border lord's daughter, dressed in traveling clothes still dusty from the road, her dark hair pinned back with the kind of practicality that suggested she had done it herself. She had arrived only an hour ago, summoned by the royal decree that had gone out across the kingdom 3 months prior. Every unmated female of noble blood between 18 and 25. One would be chosen as queen. The rest would return home. Kalen had looked at her and felt the bond snap into place like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known existed. He had rejected her anyway. The reasons were sound. House Voss was a minor house, half ruined by a border dispute his own father had started 20 years ago. Lyra had no political value, no allies, no wealth to bring to the crown. He needed a queen who would strengthen Artoria's position, not one chosen by the blind instinct of his wolf. He was a king before he was a wolf. He had always known that, so he had spoken the words calmly, formally, in front of his entire court. I, Kalen, Alpha King of Artoria, do not accept this bond. I reject you as my fated mate. And Lyra of House Voss had looked at him, really looked at him, with eyes the color of deep winter water, gray-green and utterly still, and she had said nothing. Not a single word. She did not cry. She did not beg. She did not reach for him or argue or crumble. She simply held his gaze for a long moment, long enough that several of his advisors shifted uncomfortably, long enough that the silence in the great hall became a living thing pressing against every chest in the room. Then she dipped her chin in a small, precise nod, as if he had said something entirely unremarkable, like the weather would be fine tomorrow, or dinner would be served at 7. She turned and walked out. And Kalen, King of Artoria, Alpha of 10,000 wolves, conqueror of 3 border wars and survivor of a cursed bloodline that had killed every male in his family before the age of 40, stood in the center of his great hall and felt, for the first time in his adult life, that he had done something he could not take back. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself this for 3 days. On the 4th day, he called his head advisor into his private study and asked, very casually, whether the woman from House Voss had departed yet. Advisor Renwick, who had served the crown for 30 years and had therefore learned to keep his expression entirely neutral, informed the king that Lady Lyra had not departed. She had been given a guest chamber as protocol required for all summoned nobles, and she had remained there quietly, requesting nothing, causing no trouble, speaking to no one except the maid who brought her meals. She is waiting to be dismissed, Renwick said carefully. Custom requires your formal release before she may leave. Kalen said he understood. He did not send the release. He told himself he was busy. There were trade agreements to review, a border patrol report from the Eastern Ridge, a letter from the Southern King requesting a military alliance meeting. He was a king. He did not have time to think about a quiet woman sitting in a guest chamber 3 floors above him, eating her meals alone, asking for nothing. He thought about her constantly. It was the silence. That was what he could not place, could not organize into something manageable. He had braced himself without realizing it, Some part of him had been prepared for the reaction that did not come, and the absence of it had left something exposed that he did not know how to cover. When a wound bleeds, you know what to do with it. When it simply opens silently and waits, you don't know where to press. On the 7th day, he walked to her chamber. He told himself he was going to release her formally, that he owed her that courtesy given how publicly he had spoken the rejection. He told himself it was a matter of protocol. He was very convincing, even to himself, right up until the moment he knocked on her door and heard her quiet voice say, "Come in," and he stepped inside and found her sitting by the window with a book open in her lap, looking entirely unsurprised to see him, as if she had been waiting, as if she had known he would come. "Your Majesty," she said, and her voice was exactly as he remembered it, low and steady, with no particular emotion he could name. He stood in her doorway and realized he had not planned a single word of what came next. The room was small by palace standards, though it was finer than anything she had likely occupied at the border estate. A narrow bed with a wool blanket she had folded herself. He could tell by the precise, practical corners. A writing desk with a candle burned halfway down, and a stack of letters she had clearly been composing, though she turned them face down when he entered, unhurried and without guilt. The window behind her looked out over the training yard, and the late afternoon light came through it sideways, cutting across the floor in long pale bars. She did not rise. Protocol required that she stand in his presence, and she did not. He found he did not care. "Sit," he said, because she was already sitting, and the word came out wrong, too late and slightly foolish, and he watched something flicker briefly at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Something smaller and more private than that. He stepped fully into the room. The door closed behind him. He had not brought Renwick, had not brought a guard, had not brought anyone, which he understood was its own kind of statement. "I came to offer the formal release," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Have you brought the documentation?" He had not. He had not thought about documentation. "Then it isn't formal," she said, and returned her gaze to her book. He stared at her. In 29 years, including 11 as king, no one had turned back to a book while he was standing in front of them. He was not certain there was a protocol for it. He was not certain he wanted there to be. He moved to the chair across from her window and sat down. She looked up again, and this time something shifted in her expression. Something careful and considered, as if she were reassessing a situation she thought she had already mapped. "Your Majesty," she said slowly. "I want to understand something," Kalen said. He had not planned to say this either. He seemed to have stopped planning entirely, which was deeply unlike him and also, disturbingly, felt like relief. "When I spoke the rejection," he said, "you didn't react." She considered this as if it were a reasonable topic of conversation. "No." She agreed. "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. Her fingers rested against the page of her book, not turning it, just resting there. "Because it was your choice to make," she said finally. "I wasn't going to perform grief for a room full of people who didn't know me in order to make them comfortable." He absorbed this. "The performance of grief," he repeated. She looked at him with those gray-green eyes, level and unafraid. "You know what I mean. When something hurts and you're expected to prove it hurts in a specific way, in front of an audience that wants the proof." She paused. "I wasn't going to do that. You were not in pain then. It was not quite a question." She heard the not quite question in it, and answered it anyway. "I didn't say that." The words landed quietly in the space between them. He felt them settle. He should leave. He had a trade agreement review in an hour, and a letter from the Southern King that required a diplomatic response by morning. He was the Alpha King of Artoria, and he had a great many things to do that were not sitting in a small guest chamber talking to a woman he had formally and publicly rejected 7 days ago. "How long have you known?" he asked. "That I was your mate." "Since I walked through the doors of the great hall," she said. He had felt it at the same moment. He had watched her enter and felt the bond reach across the room for him. He had rejected her within 15 minutes. "You walked toward me anyway," he said. "What else would I have done?" Her voice held something that might have been faint surprise, as if the question confused her. "Run?" She tilted her head slightly. "I don't run from things, Your Majesty. I'm not built that way." He looked at her, really looked. The way he had not permitted himself to do in the Great Hall, because looking felt dangerous, felt like conceding something. She was 22, he knew from Renwick's file. A border lord's only surviving child after her two brothers had died in the same dispute his father had created. She had managed her father's estate for the past 3 years after the old lord's health had failed. She had no political connections, no wealth, no crown value whatsoever. She had the steadiest eyes he had ever seen on a living person. "Why did you stay?" he asked. "After the rejection, you could have demanded the release immediately. Custom says I need your permission to leave." "Custom," he said, and his voice came out slightly different than he intended, slightly rougher. "You stayed because of custom." She met his gaze. "I stayed because I was curious," she said simply. "I wanted to see what you would do." He felt something shift in his chest, something tectonic and deep, the kind of movement that is barely perceptible from the surface but changes everything underground. And, "What am I doing?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "You came back," she said. He had no response to that. It was precisely accurate and therefore unanswerable. He sat with it in the pale afternoon light while she returned to her book, not dismissing him, not performing patience, simply existing quietly in the same room as him, as if his presence required nothing from her, as if she were entirely comfortable in the silence that most people found unbearable. He stayed for another hour. Neither of them spoke again. It was the most peaceful hour he had spent in 11 years. He did not send her the formal release that night. He told himself it was because he had returned to his study and found 3 urgent dispatches waiting, and the release simply had not been prioritized. This was partially true. There had been dispatches. He had also sat at his desk for a long moment after reading them and found himself thinking about the way she had said, "I don't run from things, Your Majesty," with that faint note of genuine puzzlement, as if the alternative had simply never occurred to her as an option. His mother had run. That was the thought that arrived uninvited and unwelcome. His mother had been fated to a man she did not love, and had spent every year of Kaelin's childhood running from it in smaller and smaller ways, until the running had consumed her entirely and left nothing behind but absence. He had been 9 years old when she left. He had been 11 when they received word she had died in a border province, alone, having finally run far enough that no one could reach her. He had decided very young that he would not be like his father, who had begged and broken himself, trying to hold a bond together with someone who did not want it. He had also decided he would not be like his mother. He would be the king. Kings did not chase. Kings did not beg. Kings made logical choices and held to them. He had never accounted for the possibility of someone who simply stayed. Renwick found him the next morning in the eastern courtyard, running drills with the guard captains before dawn the way he always did, when something was occupying his mind too heavily for sleep. The advisor stood at the courtyard edge with a leather folio and the particular expression of a man choosing his words. "The Lady Voss has submitted a formal request," Renwick said. Kaelin wiped sweat from his jaw with the back of his wrist. "For permission to access the library. She has apparently exhausted the volumes in her chamber and would like to read." He stared at Renwick. "She would like," he said carefully, "access to the royal library." "Yes, Your Majesty." Renwick's expression did not change. She submitted the request through proper channels, in writing, very politely. She specified she would observe all restrictions regarding restricted archives and would require no escort. Granted, Kalen said. Renwick made a small notation in the folio. Also, he said, in the same measured tone, the Southern Ambassador's office has requested a formal timeline for the military alliance discussion. They are expecting a delegation within the month. I know, Kalen said. The alliance would require a political marriage, Renwick said. As we have discussed, Lady Soren of the Southern House would be an appropriate choice. She is well connected, her father controls 3 ports, and she is, by all accounts, accomplished and personable. Kalen picked up his practice sword again. Yes, he said. I know. Renwick waited. Schedule the ambassador's meeting, Kalen said. I haven't decided anything yet. Of course, said Renwick, and withdrew. Kalen went back to his drills. He worked until his arms ached and the sun had fully risen, which was longer than usual, and it did not help the way he had hoped. He went to the library at mid-morning. He told himself he had always conducted morning reading in the library when his schedule permitted. This was true. He went to the library most mornings. He was not going because of her. He repeated this to himself with some firmness as he climbed the East Tower stairs. She was at the long reading table near the central window, surrounded by 3 open volumes and a 4th in her hands, and she looked up when he entered with the same unhurried, unsurprised expression that was beginning to feel like something he looked for. Your Majesty, she said. He moved to his usual chair at the head of the table, which happened to be 12 feet from where she was sitting, and opened the dispatch folio he had brought. He did not read the dispatches. What are you reading? He asked, after a silence that felt different from the silences they had shared before, not uncomfortable, but charged, the way air feels before a storm when everything has gone very still and very bright. She held up the volume without looking away from it. Agricultural records from the eastern provinces, 1240 to 1260. She turned a page. The crop rotation patterns during the border conflicts are interesting. She glanced up then. Your father's policies created a food shortage that took 11 years to correct. Most of the official histories don't mention it. He put down his folio. You're reading agricultural records. I manage an estate, she said simply. I'm always looking for patterns. She returned to the text. Also, she added, the official histories in your restricted section are locked, and I honored my agreement not to access them. He found himself almost smiling, which was unusual enough that he catalogued it. He was not, in general, a man who almost smiled at things. I could unlock them, he said. She looked up properly then, and he saw something open briefly in her expression before she contained it. Not suspicion, not hope exactly. Something more considered than either. Why would you do that? Because you're interested in accurate history, and I have accurate history, and you've been sitting in a guest chamber for 8 days having done nothing wrong. The bluntness of it seemed to surprise her. It surprised him, too. She looked at him for a moment. This quiet, steady examination that he was beginning to understand was not judgment, but something more like calibration. She was always figuring out where things were, what they were made of, how they held together under pressure. All right, she said. Thank you. He unlocked the restricted archive himself, rather than calling a guard, which was another thing he had not planned to do and could not entirely explain. He handed her the access key, and she took it with a serious nod, as if accepting a responsibility. She was still reading when he left 2 hours later. She did not ask him to stay. She did not perform gratitude beyond the single thank you, did not make the access into more than it was. He walked back to his official duties with the strange sensation of someone who has given something away freely and found themselves richer for it. The news reached him on a Tuesday. He was in the War Council when Renwick slipped into the chamber and placed a folded note beside his hand with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew it was urgent. Kalen read it without changing his expression. finished the sentence he was speaking to the council, and adjourned the meeting 20 minutes early. House Voss had formally accepted a betrothal offer. Lord Aldrich of House Fen, a minor northern lord with reasonable holdings and no particular distinction, had sent his offer to the border estate 10 days ago, presumably in the weeks immediately following the public rejection, when it had become clear to every house in Artoria that the woman who had been brought to court as a potential queen had not been chosen. Several houses had moved quickly. House Fen had moved first, and Lyra's father, aging and ailing and pragmatic, had accepted on her behalf. She was to be married within the season. She would leave Artoria within the fortnight, once the formal release was granted. She had not told him. He sat with this in his private study for a long time. She had known. The letters she had been writing when he first came to her room, the ones she had turned face down without any particular hurry, he understood now what they had been. Responses to her father. Discussions of terms. She had been managing her own future from a guest chamber in his castle, quietly and efficiently and without asking him for anything, while he sat in council meetings thinking about her steadiness and her gray-green eyes and the way she had said, "I'm not built for running." She had not run. She had simply made alternate arrangements. He went to the library. She was there, as she had been every morning for the past 8 days, at the same table with the same practical posture, the restricted archive key he had given her resting beside the inkwell. She looked up when he entered. He stood in the doorway. "You're leaving," he said. Her expression was very calm. "You haven't granted the release yet," she said. "So technically, no. Your father accepted the Fen offer." "Yes." She did not look away. "He's practical. It's a reasonable match." "And you?" He moved into the room. He had not meant to cross the threshold, but his body made the decision before his mind caught up. "Are you practical?" She watched him approach. "Generally, yes." Her voice was steady, but something in it had shifted, something minute and careful, like a hand holding something fragile and not letting the effort show. Kaelin stopped at the edge of the table. He could smell her now. Clean winter air and old books, and beneath that something warmer, something that his wolf recognized with an ache he had been managing for 9 days. The bond he had rejected had not dissolved entirely. It never did. Not immediately. It faded over weeks, and it had been fading, but standing this close to her, it pressed against the back of his sternum like a hand pushing from the inside. "Were you going to tell me?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think it required your input," she said. "You made your decision. I made mine." He pulled the chair across the table from her and sat. This was his library, and it was, he noted distantly, her territory now. She had been here every day, and he had come to her. He understood this. "Lyra," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. He watched her register it, watched the careful steadiness absorb the small shock of it. "Yes," she said. He put his hands flat on the table. He was not, in general, a man who was unsure of his words. He had been delivering decrees since the age of 18 and had never fumbled one. He found now that every word he had prepared on the walk across the castle had abandoned him, leaving him with only the raw material of what was true. "When I walked into the great hall 9 days ago," he said, "and the bond made itself known, I had half a second before I would have had to act on it, or reject it. I used that half second to make a calculation about political advantage and bloodline value." He paused. "I don't regret making calculations. I am a king. That is what I'm built for." She said nothing. She was listening with her entire body, the way she did everything, completely present without performing presence. "But I made the calculation too fast," he said. "I didn't account for." He stopped. Started again. "The variables I was calculating didn't include you. They included your house, and your rank, and your political utility. They didn't include the fact that you would walk into that hall knowing what you were walking into and still not flinch. They didn't include the fact that you would absorb a public rejection without breaking because you refused to perform pain for an audience. He looked at her. I was calculating the wrong things. Lyra looked at him for a long moment. The morning light came through the library window and made everything very clear, every line of her face, every shift in her expression as she worked through what he had said. That is, she said finally, a very careful way of saying you made a mistake. Something moved in his chest. It was almost a laugh. Almost. Yes, he said. It is. She was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. A thinking quiet rather than a waiting one. He let her have it. Are you asking me, she said at last, to disregard a betrothal my father has already accepted, in a political climate where refusing Lord Fen would be a considerable insult to a northern house, in order to what, exactly? Wait and see if the Alpha King changes his mind again? When she laid it out that way, he understood precisely how insufficient everything he'd just said was. And he also understood, looking at her face, that calm, careful, measuring face, that she was not saying no, she was asking him to do better, to offer something more real than regret. He met her eyes. I am asking you to give me time to undo what I did, he said. Formally, completely. I am asking you to let me fix it. The silence stretched. Outside, the training yard sounds drifted up faintly. Somewhere in the castle, a door closed. How much time? Lyra asked. As much as you need to trust that I mean it, he said. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the bond, half faded, and still there, moved between them like a tide that had never fully gone out. 1 month, she said finally. Then I decide. He began the next morning, not with flowers or jewels or any of the formal courtship gestures that his advisors would have recommended if he had told them what he was doing, which he did not. He understood, instinctively, that those things would not work with her, that she would receive them politely and file them in the same category as the public rejection. Performances, things done for audiences. She had made her position on performances very clear. He began with the thing he had already learned she valued most. Accuracy. He came to the library at dawn and left a single document on the table beside her usual chair. It was the original border dispute record from 22 years ago, the actual record, not the official history, pulled from the restricted archive, the document that showed, in the late king's own hand, the order that had dispossessed House Voss of 1,200 acres of prime eastern farmland in exchange for a political alliance that had dissolved within 4 years anyway. The record that official histories had quietly reclassified under administrative adjustments. He left it there and went to his morning drills. When he came to the library 2 hours later, she was sitting at the table with the document open before her and an expression on her face that he had not seen before. It took him a moment to name it because it was layered. Anger, he thought, yes, anger, but beneath that something older and more tired. The look of someone who has suspected a thing for a long time and has just had the suspicion confirmed. She looked up when he entered. He sat in his usual chair. He said nothing. He let her have the room. After a long moment, she said, quietly, he knew it was unjust. Your father. He knew, and he did it anyway. Yes, she looked back at the document. Her jaw was set. And House Voss was too small to push back effectively, and by the time the alliance dissolved there was no political will to revisit old land claims. Yes, she was quiet. Then, does it still stand? The original claim. Legally, he said, it was never formally extinguished. It was reclassified, which is not the same thing. She looked at him then with those level eyes and he held her gaze. I am not offering this as a courtship gesture, he said carefully, because he knew she needed to hear that clearly. The land should have been returned 15 years ago. I am beginning the process regardless of anything else. She studied him. Why now? Because I was reading your estate records, he said. The ones you referenced when you said my father's agricultural policies took 11 years to recover from. I pulled them yesterday. You have been managing land that has been producing at 60% capacity because of a boundary dispute that never should have existed. He held her gaze. That is a wrong I can correct. So I will correct it. The silence that followed was different from any silence they had shared before. It was not comfortable exactly, it was too weighted for comfort. But it was real. He could feel her reassessing him the way she always did, this careful and methodical process of figuring out what something was made of. This is a strange way to court someone, she said at last. He almost smiled again. The frequency with which she produced this almost smile in him was notable. I don't know how to court someone, he said. I know how to govern. This is what I have. She looked down at the document again. After a moment, she said, there were 17 families displaced by the same order. I know. She looked up. I've already asked Renwick to compile the full list, he said. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, simply thank you, and returned to reading, and he felt something in his chest that was not the bond. The bond was fading, and what he felt was growing, and he was beginning to understand those were separate things. He came back every morning. He did not always bring documents. Sometimes he brought nothing, simply arriving with his work and sitting at the other end of the long table while she read. Two people occupying the same space in the particular companionable quiet of those who do not need to fill silence. He learned her patterns, the way she made small notations in the margin of her personal notebooks in a precise, compressed handwriting, the way she tucked one foot under herself when she was deeply absorbed, the way she always noticed when he had not slept, because she would look up at him once, briefly, and say nothing but bring her attention back to him slightly more frequently for the rest of the morning. Checking. He learned that she had a dry and understated wit that revealed itself rarely and, without warning, landing in the middle of apparently serious conversations, and then withdrawing before he could be entirely certain it had been there. He learned that she was ferociously competent, not in the showy way of court-educated women, but in the bone-deep, practical way of someone who has been responsible for real things for a long time and has simply gotten very good at it. He learned that she was not hard, as he had first thought, but that she had built herself a kind of architecture that held its shape under pressure, and that this was different from hardness. He learned that she was lonely. This one came to him slowly, not from anything she said, but from the way she received small things, the unlocked archive, the morning visits, once when he had asked her opinion on a trade policy question, and actually listened to her answer and revised his thinking based on it, the way she held still for a fraction of a second before responding, as if she were checking that the thing being offered was real, as if she had trained herself not to reach for things too quickly, because reaching had not historically been safe. He thought about that. He thought about it more than was comfortable. On the 14th day, something changed. It happened in the small council chamber, not the library. He had asked her, with the careful formality he was still learning to discard, whether she would be willing to review the draft trade agreement with the eastern provinces before he finalized it. He had phrased it as a professional request. Because it was, and because she responded better to professional requests than to personal ones, she had more practice with competence than with being wanted, and he was trying to meet her where she was. She had come to the council chamber and sat across from him and read through the 40-page document with the same focused attention she gave everything, making small notations on a separate page. He had worked through his own dispatches across the table. After an hour, she had slid her notes toward him, and he had read them. And then he had looked up at her. You caught the loophole in Article 7, he said. She nodded. The language around transit tariffs is ambiguous. If left as written, the Eastern Lords can argue it exempts overland routes from the new rates entirely. You'd lose approximately a third of the projected revenue. His trade advisor had not caught it. The Royal Legal Council had not caught it. He had not caught it. "How did you see that?" he asked. She looked at him with that level, slightly puzzled expression she sometimes wore when she could not understand why something surprised him. "My father's estate is on the transit route," she said. "I've been dealing with tariff disputes for 3 years. I know what ambiguous language looks like because people have tried to use it against us." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "When Renwick gave me your file 3 months ago," he said carefully, "it listed Hausfoss as a minor house with no significant court value. No political connections, no military holdings. Revenue below the threshold that was considered meaningful." She nodded. "That is accurate. It did not list," he said, "that you have been single-handedly managing a failing estate for 3 years while your father declined. It did not list that you had restored the grain production to near baseline without outside capital. It did not list that you had negotiated a water rights agreement with the neighboring house that 3 previous lords had failed to resolve." He paused. "I found these things in the estate records. After I started paying attention." She said nothing. Her expression had gone very still. "I made a decision about your value," he said, "based on incomplete information. And I want you to know I understand that the incompleteness was not accidental. People like you, quietly capable people who do not advertise themselves, tend to be invisible to systems that are looking for loudness. I built my assessment of this court on data someone else organized, and the organizing reflected their assumptions." He was not accustomed to saying things like this out loud. It felt like standing in an open field, no walls, nothing overhead. He made himself continue. "I am trying to tell you that I see you, not as a correction to an error, not as a diplomatic gesture." He held her gaze. "I see you, and I was blind to you for 9 days, and then I looked, and I have not been able to stop looking since." The silence went on for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than usual. "That is still," she said slowly, a very careful way of saying something. He let out a breath. "What would you like me to say instead?" She looked at him, not more carefully. Something more was in her face now, not open exactly, but opened, as if something had been set aside. "Tell me," she said, "what you want. Not what you're offering, not what you're correcting, what you actually want." He looked at her across the table. He had been a king for 11 years. He had been asked what he wanted precisely never. "I want," he said, and his voice came out low, "I want you to stop being a guest in this castle. I want you to stop writing letters to your father about men you're going to settle for because I made you feel like settling was the best available option. I want to see what you do with a kingdom when someone gives you the authority to match the capability you already have." He paused. "And I want—" He stopped. She waited. She was very good at waiting. "I want to learn how to be in the same room with someone without the room feeling like a performance," he said. "I have not known how to do that before. In your company, I almost know how." Her hands were resting on the table, very still. Her eyes were bright. Not with tears. She did not cry. He knew that now. It was not her way. But with something alert and awake and new. "You would have to unsend the rejection," she said carefully, formally, publicly. "You would have to stand in the same great hall and do it in front of the same court." "I know. That is not a small thing. People will say you were weak. I know that too." She looked at him for a long time. Something in her chest was moving in a way she did not entirely have words for. She, who always had words for everything, who managed everything with language and precision and clear-eyed practicality, found herself in a place language did not quite reach. "Ask me," she said quietly. He looked at her across the council table, in the ordinary afternoon light, with no ceremony around them, no court, no audience. Just 2 people in a room who had both been quiet for too long for different reasons. "Will you stay?" he said. Not as a guest, not under protocol. Will you stay because you choose to? The silence lasted 3 full heartbeats. Yes, she said. He announced it the following morning, not at a formal court session. He did not want it to be a formal court session. Did not want the weight of ceremony to make it into a performance when the entire point was that they were done with performances. He gathered the court in the great hall after the morning meal, casually, the way one might gather people to discuss a change in the weekly schedule, and he stood where he had stood 11 days ago, and he said, simply and clearly, and without embellishment, that he had made an error in judgment on the matter of the fated bond, and that he was withdrawing the formal rejection with full recognition of its political implications. The hall was very quiet. Lyra stood at the edge of the room, against the wall, not at his side. They had agreed on that. She had asked to be at the edge, and he had understood why. She did not want to be a visual prop for his correction. She wanted to stand in her own place while he stood in his, and both of them chose separately in the same direction. He saw several things in the faces of his court. Surprise. In some of the older advisors, something that might have been relief. In others, the ones who had been quietly compiling lists of politically advantageous candidates, the ones who had already dispatched correspondence to Lady Soren's household, a carefully concealed recalculation. He did not look at Lyra while he spoke. He had told her he would not. He would not make it a scene about her reaction, would not watch her face to see how she received it, would not turn her response into proof of his own redemption. This was not about him being redeemed. This was about a wrong being corrected. He finished speaking and adjourned the gathering without ceremony and walked back to his study. She came to him an hour later. She knocked twice, quietly, and when he said enter, she came in and stood just inside the door, and her face was composed and her hands were still, and she looked at him with those gray-green eyes that had not blinked when he had rejected her in front of 100 people 11 days ago. "How are you?" he asked. She thought about this with the seriousness she gave everything. "Fine," she said. The word held layers, not dismissive, but a true and considered assessment. Fine as in standing, intact, clear on who I am. "Good," he said. She moved further into the room and sat in the chair across from his desk, without being invited and without ceremony, which told him something about how much had shifted. She looked around his study, the maps, the stacked documents, the general organized chaos of a working king's workspace, with the attentive cataloging gaze of someone planning to be here for a long time. "It will be complicated," she said. "The announcement." "Yes. House Fen will be insulted. Renwick has already drafted the diplomatic correspondence. There will be a concession offered, access to the new eastern trade route. Lord Fen is practical. He'll accept." She looked at him. "You prepared for that before the announcement." Of course, something moved in her expression, not surprise exactly, but its quieter cousin, the small recalibration that happens when something turns out to be exactly what it appeared to be. "I need to send word to my father," she said. "I know. You may use the royal courier." She nodded. "He'll be relieved," she said, and there was something very dry in it, and also something old and unsentimental. He wants the estate settled before he dies. This is settling, even if it wasn't the version he expected. There was a silence, not uncomfortable. Their silences had never been uncomfortable. "I need to ask you something," she said. He put down the document he had been pretending to read. "Yes, you said, in the council chamber," she began carefully, "that you want to see what I do with authority to match my capability." She paused. "Did you mean that?" "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "Because there are 17 families whose land was taken by your father's order, and the process I imagine you have begun moves through official channels at official pace, which means probably years." He said nothing. "I know these families," she said. "I grew up on the border. I know their situations. I know the land disputes. I know the specific legal obstacles in each case. She met his eyes. Give me the authority, and I will have the restorations drafted within 6 weeks. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the document he had been pretending to read and held it out to her. She took it. Read the heading. Looked up at him. It was a provisional authority document. Already drafted. Already signed, granting the Lady Lyra Voss, future Queen of Artoria, full discretionary power over the eastern border claims resolution. He had done it 3 days ago, when he had started to understand what she was. She looked at the document for a long time. He watched her work to keep her expression steady, and watched her not quite succeed. Watched something warm and real and surprised move across her face before she brought it back under control. You were very confident, she said, that I'd say yes. He held her gaze. No, he said. I was very certain you were the right person for the work regardless of what you decided about me. She was quiet. The document rested in her hands. After a long moment, she said, her voice slightly lower than usual, I would like to learn how to be in a room without performing, too. I haven't known how to do that either, for different reasons. He nodded. He understood the different reasons. Then they sat in his study in the afternoon light, each with their own work, in the particular silence of 2 people who have stopped pretending and started beginning. And outside the castle, the kingdom went about its business entirely unaware that in a room in the eastern wing, something quiet and real and unhurried was becoming itself. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them. She moved from the guest chamber to the Queen's suite on the 3rd week, not because anyone demanded it, but because Renwick had gently noted that the formal betrothal announcement had gone out to all noble houses, and it would be appropriate for the future queen to occupy the appropriate chambers. She had agreed with characteristic practicality and moved her things herself, which had caused her new household staff considerable distress until she explained she was not dismissing them. She simply did not need assistance with carrying books. She kept the key to the restricted archive. He had not asked for it back, and she had not offered it. They developed a habit of evenings in the private sitting room adjacent to his study, not planned, not scheduled, simply the natural result of 2 people whose working days both ended late and who had discovered that ending them in proximity was easier than ending them alone. She would bring her estate correspondence or her legal notes on the border restorations. He would bring his council reports or his military dispatches. They would sit across from each other and work in silence that was punctuated occasionally by one of them reading something aloud that seemed relevant, or asking the other's opinion on a decision, or saying nothing at all. It was the most functional his evenings had been in 11 years. He had not realized how loud silence could be until he found a silence that was actually quiet. On a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the announcement, she looked up from her notes and said, "Tell me about the curse." He went still. She held his gaze, not aggressively, not with demand, just with the steady attention she gave everything. "I know about it," she said. "The cold in your family. The pattern." "I found references in the restricted archive," she paused, "with your permission." He had given her full access. He had not specifically thought about what full access meant. He put down his report. He thought about the answer for a long moment, which she allowed him, watching without pressing. His great-grandfather had made a bargain, he said finally, the way people did in the old histories, with old powers that were not precisely spirits, and not precisely gods, but something older and stranger than either. He wanted victory in a war that should have been unwinnable. He got it. The price was a bloodline curse. Every male of the line would carry winter in his blood, cold to the touch, body temperature falling over decades, dying before 50 unless the curse was broken. "How is it broken?" she asked. He looked at her. "A true bond," he said, "not a convenient one, not a political one." the genuine fated bond, accepted and completed. He paused. My father never accepted his. He spent his life fighting it. My grandfather died at 43, believing the cold was a disease rather than a curse. And you, she said carefully, how cold is it? He held out his hand across the table, palm up. She reached out and pressed her fingers to his wrist, at the pulse point. He watched her face. He saw the moment she felt it, the temperature of him, not just cool but genuinely cold, the kind of cold that should not exist inside a living body. She did not pull away. She wrapped her hand around his wrist and held it. Does it hurt? She asked. Not the cold itself, he said. The isolation is harder. She was quiet, her hand still warm and real against his wrist. When you rejected the bond, she said slowly, you were also, she stopped. Started again. You understood that the rejection meant the curse would continue, that you would keep getting colder. Yes, she looked at him with something in her face that he was not yet skilled enough to read fully. He was learning her expressions the way you learn a new language, from context and immersion, and some of them were still new. This one was part anger, part something that might have been pain on his behalf, and underneath both of them something fierce and decided. Why? She said. Why would you choose that? He held her gaze because the alternative was binding someone to me by need rather than choice. He paused. I could feel what the bond would mean for my survival. I could also feel that it would be using you. I calculated that it was better to choose the cold than to accept a bond where my need was the primary force. She stared at him. That, she said, is the most profoundly foolish thing I have ever heard. Something in his chest moved. He almost laughed. Almost. You were willing to die, she said, rather than accept something that might have helped you because you thought I couldn't handle the complexity. She held his wrist tighter, not roughly, just firmly, anchoring. I am not fragile. You do not have to protect me from complicated things. I understand that now, he said quietly. Do you? She looked at him. Because what I am hearing is that you have spent years treating the possibility of needing someone as equivalent to wronging them, and that is, she searched for the word, that is not how need works. That is not what it is. He said nothing. He was listening with the careful attention of someone receiving information about themselves that they did not know they needed. Need is not a trap, she said. It's not a manipulation. It is just the truth of being alive. She paused. I need things too. I needed for someone to look at the border records and be angry on behalf of 17 families. I needed to be asked for my opinion and have it actually change something. She met his eyes. I needed you to come back to my room. That doesn't make me weak. It makes me honest. He looked at her for a long moment. You are, he said slowly, quite extraordinary. She made a small sound that was not quite dismissal and not quite acceptance, something in between. She had not let go of his wrist. I am going to break the curse, she said. Not because you need me to, because the curse was unjust and your great-grandfather made a stupid bargain and you should not have to be cold for the rest of your shortened life because of a war he fought before your grandfather was born. She paused. And also because I choose to. Both things can be true simultaneously. He looked at their joined hands, her warm, his cold, the contrast stark and obvious. Both things can be true. He agreed. The bond completed on a night when no one was watching and nothing was ceremonial. They had been sitting in the private sitting room for 3 hours. She had finished her border restoration drafts, 6 weeks she had promised, and she had done it in 4, with a thoroughness that had made his legal counsel quietly panicked and privately impressed, and she had set the notes aside and looked at him in the way she sometimes did when the work was done and something else was present in the room. He had put his work down too. They had been learning each other slowly, carefully, in the way of two people who had both been burned by speed and had agreed without saying so to let things arrive in their own time. There had been evenings that ended with her hand in his on the walk from the sitting room to the hall where their suites separated. There had been a morning when he had arrived at the library to find her asleep in the chair, her cheek against her notes, and he had draped his own coat around her shoulders and left without waking her, and spent the morning in his study with a particular warmth in his chest that no coat could explain. There had been a day in the Eastern Gardens when she had been reviewing a disputed land map, and he had come to stand behind her to look at it, and had stayed, and the space between them had compressed very slowly until his chin was beside her temple, and neither of them was looking at the map anymore, and she had turned her head slightly, and they had been very close. And then she had said, quietly and without fanfare, "You can," and so he had. The first kiss had been brief, careful, cold on his side, and warm on hers and over, before either of them had entirely processed it, followed by a silence of the companionable kind where both of them looked at the map again and did not speak for a full minute, and then she had said, still looking at the map, "Again, please." And so that had happened too. They had moved slowly after that as well. Not from uncertainty, but from preference. They were both people who found that slow things held their shape better, that things built in increments were sturdier than things rushed toward. They talked in the evenings. They sat in comfortable parallel work. They walked the Eastern Gardens when the weather was cool, and she pointed out the mistakes in the garden's drainage plan, with the focused irritation of someone who had spent years solving water-related agricultural problems and found bad drainage personally offensive. He found her endlessly interesting. This surprised him. He had expected admiration, had expected the bond's pull, had not expected to find her actively fascinating, her mind, the way it worked. The particular combination of practicality and depth that meant she could discuss crop rotation with the same quality of attention she gave philosophical questions about justice. He had not expected to like her as much as he did, as a person, as someone he would have sought out even if the bond had never existed. He told her this one evening. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I like you too. More than I expected to." And that is not a small thing for me to say. He understood why it wasn't small. He was beginning to understand the full landscape of what she had been through before this. The family that saw her as an asset to be managed rather than a person to be known. The years of competence in service of survival rather than choice. The way she had built that interior architecture to hold its shape because there was no one else to hold it. He did not try to dismantle it. He understood now that was not what she needed. She had not built it for protection against safety. She had built it because she was herself, and herself was careful and private and real, and the right response to that was not to tear down the walls, but to build something alongside her that she could lean against if she chose to. On the night the bond completed, it was raining outside, and she had fallen asleep in his sitting room and woken to find him still there, still reading, the lamp burning low. She had watched him for a moment before he noticed she was awake, and in that unguarded moment, he looked different, she thought. Less arranged. The careful kingship composure that he wore like a second skin had slipped in the lamplight while he thought no one was watching, and what was underneath was younger and quieter and more uncertain, and she found she loved it. She had not said the word before, even to herself. It arrived now without drama, without announcement, the way truths sometimes do. She said his name. Just that, Kalen, not your majesty, not the formal address, just his name, and he looked up. And she looked at him in the lamplight and said, "I think we should complete the bond." He was very still, not in the careful, controlled way of a king keeping his composure, but in the still way of someone receiving something they have wanted very much and were not sure they were allowed to want. "Are you certain?" he asked. She considered this with the full seriousness she gave all important things. "Yes," she said. Not because of the curse. She met his eyes. Because I want to. Both things are true, but this one matters more. He set down his book. He rose from his chair. He crossed the room to where she was sitting and crouched before her so they were level, eye to eye, no height differential, no ceremony, and he took her hands in his cold ones. I am going to spend, he said, a very long time making up for the 11 days I was a fool. She looked at him steadily. That sounds acceptable, she said. He kissed her hands, knuckles, fingers, the inside of her wrist where he could feel her pulse warm and fast against his cold mouth, and she pulled him forward, and then they were close in the lamplight in the rain, and the bond moved between them like a tide coming in, and this time neither of them turned from it. The cold began to leave him within a week. It happened gradually, the way the bond had built, not in a dramatic moment but in increments, like a winter retreating. He noticed it first in his hands, which had always been the worst of it, the first place the cold had settled when he was 18, and would be the last place to release it. He woke one morning to find them only cool rather than cold, and lay in the gray early light next to Lyra's warmth, feeling something he could not immediately name. She noticed before he could tell her. She was reviewing documents in the sitting room when she reached for his hand to pass him a page and paused, her fingers wrapped around his. She looked at him. You're warmer, she said. He looked at their hands. Yes, she looked at him for a long moment with an expression he had learned by now. It was the one she wore when she was absorbing something she had been hoping for, but had not let herself rely on. How long? She asked. He had not told her everything about the progression. She had read what was in the archive, but the archive did not hold the full truth of what cold felt like from inside it. The way it had been getting worse each year, the way he had started wearing extra layers in the summer and still felt it, the way he had begun, quietly and without telling anyone, to prepare for the possibility that he would not reach 40. 5 years ago, he said, I was already colder than my father had been at this stage. She was quiet. Her hand had not released his. Then, we have a lot of time to make up for, she said finally. Practically. Her voice was slightly rough at the edge, and he understood that was as much as she would let show, and he honored it. The border restorations were ratified on the 40th day, all 17 families. The land grant reversals had been drafted by Lyra, reviewed by the legal council, and signed by Kaelin with the full force of royal decree. She had managed it with the focused efficiency that characterized everything she did, personally corresponding with each family, arranging surveys of the returned lands, ensuring the legal language was airtight enough that it could not be quietly reclassified again in 30 years by a future king with different priorities. He had watched her do all of it. He had watched her in council, where she sat now as his formal partner queen, not at the foot of the table but at his right hand. Because he had asked her where she wanted to sit, and she had said where I can see everyone's face, which had told him everything about how she operated. He had watched the council members adjust to her, the initial skepticism that happened quietly and in glances rather than voices. The gradual shift that occurred when they realized she had read everything they had read, and also things they had not thought to read, and that her questions were the specific, informed kind that required real answers rather than diplomatic ones. He had watched her in the eastern provinces when they made the formal trip to oversee the first land grants returned. She had walked the boundary lines with the families herself, had spoken to them with the directness of someone who had been one difficulty away from their situation, and he had seen them look at her, this young woman who was about to be their queen, with something that was not the formal deference of court, but the particular respect people extend to those who have actually shown up. He was proud of her. The feeling was enormous and quiet and specific, nothing like the broad, abstract pride of a king in his kingdom. This was personal. This was earned. She came to him one evening with a letter from her father. She held it without offering it to him, and he did not ask to read it. She stood by the window with the light behind her, and he watched her face. He's happy, she said. She paused. That I'm settled. That the estate will pass to a proper heir eventually. That House Voss will have a queen in the family. He heard what was underneath this. Does he know you? He asked. Not the estate value. Does he know who you are? She was quiet for a long moment. He never needed to, she said finally. I was useful to him, and he treated me well enough. And that was what we were. Kalen crossed the room. He did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would correct 22 years, and he had learned that she did not want things corrected. She wanted them witnessed. So he stood beside her, and she leaned against him, briefly, the kind of lean that is not weakness but a small, deliberate release, and he stayed very still so she could feel that the thing she was leaning against would not move. After a moment, she straightened. I want to build something different, she said. For the kingdom. She glanced at him. The way I was invisible to your court systems. There are a great many people in this kingdom who are invisible to those systems. Capable people who don't advertise themselves. Who are in the wrong houses or the wrong classes or the wrong gender and therefore don't get counted. She paused. I would like to change some of the counting. He nodded. She looked at him sideways. You don't want to know what I have in mind? He almost smiled. Tell me, he said. She told him. He listened to her for an hour. He asked questions that made her revise 2 of her approaches and sharpen 3 others. She asked him questions about which political obstacles were structural versus personal, which could be routed around and which required direct engagement. They stood by the window as the evening came down and talked about the kingdom the way 2 people talk about something that belongs to both of them, neither performing, neither asking permission, just thinking out loud together. This is what I wanted, he thought. Not a queen who would stand beside him and look appropriate. A person who would stand beside him and think. The coronation was set for the first day of spring. She had not asked for it to be spring. That had been her household staff's suggestion, and she had agreed because spring seemed logical, rather than because she cared about symbols. He knew this because she had told him so, directly, on the evening the date was announced, in the mild tone of someone heading off a potential misunderstanding. I don't need it to mean something, she had said. It just needs to happen on a day that makes practical sense for the travel of the noble houses. He had found this enormously clarifying, the way she always was. In the weeks before the coronation, she threw herself into the practical work of queenship, with the energy of someone who has spent a long time doing difficult things with inadequate resources, and has been handed, somewhat suddenly, adequate ones. The Academy for Border Studies, her name for it, deliberately unglamorous, was her primary project, a formal institution for training young people from minor and common houses in estate management, law, agricultural planning. Land rights. The thing she had needed and never had, formalized and made available. The noble houses had opinions about it. Several opinions, expressed in several directions, ranging from enthusiastic support from the houses whose own children would benefit to careful skepticism from those who preferred that certain kinds of knowledge remain in certain kinds of hands. She received all opinions with the same level attention and responded to concerns with such thorough preparedness that the conversations tended to reach the same place. The point at which her interlocutor ran out of objections, and she had answered all of them and everyone in the room. Understood that the academy was happening, the only question was the specific details. He sat in on several of these meetings. He had not planned to. He had found himself in the corridor once when she was mid-conversation with 3 resistant lords and had stepped inside, which had caused the lords to straighten and shift into formal mode, and she had glanced at him with one of her brief readable-only-to-him expressions, not asking him to intervene, but not asking either, and he had taken the chair in the corner and said, "Please continue," and listened while she finished making her case, which she did, entirely under her own momentum. Afterward, he had caught her in the corridor. She was reviewing her notes. He fell into step beside her. "You didn't need me in there," he said. "No," she agreed, not looking up from her notes. He said nothing. She glanced at him sideways, but it was useful when they switched from arguing substance to looking for permission. She returned to her notes. "You're good at that part." The permission granting, he almost said something, stopped. Then he said, "I want you to know that when I'm not in the room, the permission is already granted. You don't need me there for it to be real." She stopped walking. She turned to look at him. He met her gaze. "I mean that structurally," he said. "I'm going to formalize it before the coronation. Your authority over the academy and the border programs is not contingent on my presence or my continued approval. It belongs to the role. It will belong to the role after I'm gone, passed to whoever comes next." He paused. "You are not going to spend 20 years building something and then have it disassembled because the next king has different priorities." She looked at him for a long time. Something moved in her face that he had learned to read now, the careful assessment she gave things, checking whether they were real, and then the moment when the checking resolved and she allowed the thing to land. "Thank you," she said, quietly. Not an elaborate thank you. Not performed gratitude, just 2 words that carried the full weight of what they meant, the specific, genuine relief of someone who has built things before and had them taken, told that this time it is different. He nodded. She went back to her notes. He walked beside her. On the night before the coronation, she could not sleep. He woke to find her sitting in the chair by the window, still and quiet in the gray early morning dark, and he lay watching her for a moment before he said her name. She turned. "Come back to bed," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "I'm thinking," she said. "You can think here." She studied him in the dark, this careful study that was not doubt but presence, making sure she was seeing him clearly. Then she came back to bed and lay beside him, and he was warm now, genuinely warm, and she pulled his arm around her, and he felt her take a long, slow breath and release it. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. The silence had its shape, thinking quiet, the working kind. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I walked into your Great Hall 40 3 days ago expecting to be assessed and dismissed." She paused. "I was not expecting any of this. Are you glad of it?" Another pause, longer. "Yes," she said, comprehensively. He pressed his mouth to her hair. "Cold over cruelty," he said quietly. "You chose cold over cruelty." She made a small sound. "You were never cruel," she said. "Just confused about what you needed." He thought about this. That is a generous reading. It's an accurate one. She settled closer. "I don't do generous readings. You know that." He did know that. It was one of the things he loved most about her, that when she told him something was true, he could rely on it being true rather than kind. They lay in the dark before the coronation morning, both awake and neither performing sleep, in the comfortable specific quiet of 2 people who have stopped needing to fill space and started simply occupying it together. The kingdom outside was already beginning to stir. He could hear it distantly. The particular altered energy of a city preparing for ceremony. In a few hours the great hall would be full again, and she would walk into it again, and this time when the court looked at her it would be as queen. She knew what she was walking into. She was not afraid of halls full of people watching. She had walked into one before, at a terrible moment, with nothing and no one, and she had not flinched then. She would not flinch now. He thought about the moment he had rejected her. He thought about it sometimes still, not with guilt that pulled him backward, but with the clarity of understanding why it had happened and what it had cost. He had been a king making calculations, and the calculations had been wrong, and the wrongness had been revealed not in the disaster he had expected it to produce, but in the silence it had produced instead. She had not given him her pain to manage. She had taken her pain and stood in it, alone, until he was ready to look. And then, she had let him look. That was courage of a particular kind, not the loud kind, the kind that holds its shape in the dark. He had tried to be worthy of it. He would keep trying. Tomorrow, she said quietly. Tomorrow, he agreed. She took his hand and held it, his warm hand in her warm one, and outside the spring morning came slowly up over Artoria, pale gold and unhurried, and inside the castle in the queen's chamber a king and a queen lay quietly together on the edge of everything that was about to begin, and neither of them needed to say anything else, because everything that mattered had already been said, in the silences between the words. In the patience and the staying and the choosing. Again and again and again, without performance, without audience, without anything except the plain and solid truth of two people who had found in each other the one thing neither had known they were looking for. Not rescue. Not completion. Just someone who stayed.